Based on recent developments, something unusual is happening in the corridors of power between Washington and Beijing. While the headlines often focus on the friction between these two superpowers, a closer look at the actual movement of goods, capital, and high-level personnel reveals a much more nuanced and perhaps more calculated dance than the public rhetoric suggests. We are currently seeing a rare moment where a sitting U.S. president and the CEO of the world's most valuable semiconductor company are in the Chinese capital at the same time. Yet the very products they are there to discuss are effectively frozen in transit. This paradox of high-level engagement paired with a total standstill in the delivery of critical technology raises a fundamental question. Is this a breakdown in the supply chain, or a sophisticated recalibration of the global balance of power? To understand the weight of this moment, we have to look at the immediate economic environment. According to recent data from the U.S. Commerce Department, producer prices jumped 6% year-over-year this April. To put that in perspective, think of the Producer Price Index as the early warning system for your local grocery store or gas station. When it spikes 4% in a single month, it's a signal that consumer prices are likely to follow suit. This isn't just a statistical anomaly. It's a direct reflection of the pressure environment in global energy markets. With the national gasoline average hitting $4.51 per gallon, the economic stakes for the current summit in Beijing could not be higher. Does this surge in domestic costs provide the U.S. administration with an incentive to seek a stabilizing deal, or does it harden the resolve to maintain a competitive lead at all costs? The centerpiece of this tension is the Nvidia H200 AI chip. On paper, the U.S. Commerce Department has cleared the path for approximately 10 of China's largest tech entities, including Alibaba and Tencent, to purchase these high-performance processors. However, despite this regulatory green light, the number of actual H200 deliveries to Chinese firms currently stands at 0. This leads us to a significant curiosity gap. Why would a government approve a sale and then see no movement on the ground? The answer may lie in the fine print of the arrangement. The U.S. negotiated a framework where it receives a 25% revenue cut from these sales, with the condition that the chips must be routed through U.S. territory for what is essentially a security audit. Think of it like this: if you were buying a high-end security system for your home, but the manufacturer insisted it be routed to their warehouse for inspection first, while they also took a massive percentage of the sale price as a fee, would you still want the product? This requirement has created a massive bottleneck and a significant layer of distrust. For Beijing, the prospect of domestic tech giants relying on hardware that has been physically handled and potentially tagged by U.S. authorities is a difficult pill to swallow. This raises an important question. Is the delay a result of U.S. caution, or is it a deliberate choice by Beijing to protect its own technological sovereignty by refusing the terms of the deal? While the tech standoff continues, the global energy map is being redrawn by conflict. Since the end of February, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has removed approximately 8 million barrels of oil per day from the global market. That is roughly equivalent to the entire daily production of the United States suddenly vanishing from the global supply pool. When you remove that much volume from the world's most critical maritime choke point, the ripples are felt everywhere, from the boardroom of an appliance manufacturer in Michigan to the manufacturing hubs in Guangdong. Based on available data, U.S. truck freight costs have already risen by more than 8% in just 1 month. This isn't just an energy problem, it's a systemic cost of living adjustment that is beginning to filter through every layer of the economy. If global trade is the lifeblood of the modern world, then the Strait of Hormuz is the carotid artery. With it constricted, we see companies like Whirlpool reporting a 10% drop in revenue, while simultaneously being forced to implement double-digit price hikes just to maintain their margins. It's a classic squeeze: higher input costs and lower consumer demand. This brings us to a key pattern recognition insight. When domestic economic pressure reaches a certain threshold, foreign policy often shifts from idealistic competition to pragmatic stabilization. Is the presence of President Trump and Jensen Huang in Beijing a sign that the economic pressure environment has reached a point where both sides are looking for an exit ramp? The diplomatic signals, however, remain deeply contradictory. Inside the U.S. administration, there appears to be a clear divergence in strategy regarding how to handle the Iran-China link. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has publicly stated that Washington intends to pressure Beijing to use its economic leverage over Tehran to reopen the strait. Yet, in a striking contrast, the president has downplayed the idea of asking for such favors, suggesting that U.S. economic concerns will not dictate the approach to the conflict in Iran. This raises a critical question about the unified nature of U.S. foreign policy. who is actually setting the terms of the engagement. If the leadership isn't on the same page regarding the use of leverage, it gives Beijing an opening to play different factions of the US government against each other. According to multiple sources, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been very clear about their red lines, specifically regarding Taiwan. While the US has approved an $11 billion weapons package for the island, that hardware remains unfulfilled and undelivered. This creates a fascinating strategic parallel with the Nvidia chips. In both cases, the US has approved a transfer of high-value technology, one for defense, one for AI, but in both cases, the physical items are not moving. Some analysts suggest this indicates that the administration may be positioning these unfulfilled commitments as negotiable assets. Could the $11 billion in defense support for Taiwan be the ultimate bargaining chip in securing a grand bargain on energy and trade? This leads us to the internal dynamics within China. While US hardliners might view the delay in Nvidia deliveries as a victory for American AI supremacy, there is another interpretation. Reporting suggests that Beijing is actively discouraging its own tech giants from executing these pre-approved orders. Instead of accepting the US terms, the Chinese government appears to be forcing an accelerated shift toward domestic alternatives like Huawei and DeepSeek. Think of it as a forced evolution. By creating a barrier to entry for Nvidia, Beijing is essentially providing its domestic industry with a captive market and a do-or-die incentive to innovate. This suggests a calculated pivot. China may be willing to endure short-term technological lag to achieve long-term hardware independence. This strategic patience is a hallmark of the current Chinese leadership, but it comes with immense risks. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, China's massive manufacturing sector faces a structural crisis. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, and a significant portion of that comes through the very choke point that is currently blocked. At what point does the cost of supporting an ally like Iran outweigh the benefits of challenging US hegemony? This is the invisible tension hanging over the summit in Beijing. It's not just about chips or tariffs. It's about the fundamental survival of the global manufacturing model as we've known it for the last 30 years. Adding another layer of complexity is the recent confirmation of Kevin Warsh as the chair of the Federal Reserve. This is a pivotal moment for US monetary policy. For much of early 2026, the markets were pricing in a series of rate cuts, hoping for a soft landing. However, with producer prices rising at 6%, the Fed's mandate becomes significantly more difficult. If the inflation fire is being stoked by energy costs that are beyond the Fed's control, how can they justify cutting rates? Warsh now faces a dilemma: keep rates high to fight inflation and risk a deeper recession, or cut rates to support growth and risk a runaway price spiral. The financial markets are watching this Beijing summit not just for trade news but for any sign of an energy deal that might give the Fed room to breathe. What we are witnessing is a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess where the board is the entire global economy. Every move, whether it's a delayed shipment of chips, an unfulfilled arms deal, or a visit to a foreign capital, is designed to test the resolve of the opponent. The fact that Jensen Huang is part of this diplomatic mission is particularly telling. It signals that the line between corporate strategy and national security has completely evaporated. Nvidia isn't just a company anymore. It's a strategic asset of the state, and its products are the new currency of international relations. But if the currency can't be spent, if the chips can't be delivered, what is its actual value in a negotiation? As we look at the immediate implications, the most glaring reality is the Thucydides trap mentioned by President Xi, the historical pattern where a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, often leading to conflict. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has warned that if the relationship isn't handled properly, it could lead to clashes that put the entire global order in jeopardy. Yet the very presence of a summit suggests that neither side is ready for a total break. There's a mutual dependency that is proving very difficult to unwind. The US needs China to help stabilize energy and keep consumer goods flowing, while China needs access to the high-end technology that, for now, only the US and its allies can provide. This brings us to a compelling curiosity gap regarding the Nvidia deal. Is the 25% revenue tax and the US territory routing a genuine security measure, or was it designed to be so unpalatable that China would be forced to reject it? If it was a poison pill, it has worked perfectly. It allows the US stored to claim it is open for business, while effectively ensuring that no top-tier AI hardware reaches Chinese soil. However, this strategy only works if the US can maintain its own lead. As Chris McGuire of the Council on Foreign Relations pointed out, every chip sold to China is one fewer chip available for US firms. In a world of finite resources, trade isn't just about profit. It's about the allocation of future power. As we wrap up this first part of our look into the shifting landscape, we have to consider the long-term trajectory. We have a situation where inflation is surging, energy supplies are strangled, and the world's two most important leaders are sitting across from each other trying to navigate a path forward. The stakes aren't just about the next quarter's earnings, they are about the structure of the 21st century economy. Is this summit the beginning of a grand bargain that will reopen the shipping lanes and restart the flow of technology, or is it merely a well-staged photo op before a much deeper frost sets in? The answer likely lies in the unresolved status of those 75,000 H-200 chips and the $11 billion in silent weapons. These are the missing pieces of a puzzle that, once solved, will define the next decade of global history. The unresolved status of those 75,000 Nvidia H-200 chips serves as a microcosm for a much larger, structural transformation in the global order. While the immediate headlines focus on the logistics of shipping and the specifics of trade permits, the deeper reality is that we are moving into an era where high-end technology is no longer just a commodity, but a core component of national sovereignty. This shift fundamentally changes how we view the current summit in Beijing. It is not just about the numbers on a balance sheet. It's about which nation will hold the keys to the next industrial revolution. Based on current data, the hesitation we see on both sides, the US, with its 25% revenue tax, and Beijing with its quiet discouragement of purchases, suggests that both superpowers are preparing for a future where they are significantly less dependent on each other. Think of it like a long-term decoupling that is being managed in real time to prevent a sudden, catastrophic break. This leads us to the critical role of the Federal Reserve under its new chair, Kevin Warsh. For years, the global economy functioned on the assumption of low inflation and open trade routes. However, with the U.S. Producer Price Index rising by 6% and energy costs jumping over 22%, the foundational assumptions of American monetary policy are being tested. Warsh enters a landscape where traditional tools like adjusting interest rates may have limited impact on inflation that is being driven by geopolitical supply shocks rather than domestic demand. When the Strait of Hormuz is closed and 8 million barrels of oil are removed from the market daily, the resulting price spikes are essentially an external tax on every business and household in America. This raises an important question. Can a central bank truly manage an economy when the primary drivers of cost are happening thousands of miles away in a conflict zone? To understand the scale of this challenge, consider the impact on the American consumer. With national gasoline prices hitting $4.51 per gallon, the energy tax is beginning to significantly erode discretionary spending. This isn't just a theory. It is reflected in the earnings of major corporations like Whirlpool, which saw a 10% revenue drop. When basic costs rise so sharply, the soft landing that economists hoped for in 2026 becomes much harder to achieve. Pattern recognition suggests that we are entering a period of cost-push inflation, a scenario where the Fed might be forced to keep interest rates higher for longer, even as the economy begins to slow. This creates a high-stakes environment for the Beijing summit, as the U.S. administration may see a trade or energy breakthrough with China as the only viable pressure valve for domestic economic stability. But why would China cooperate? This is where the curiosity gap becomes most apparent. Historically, China has used its massive manufacturing sector as a stabilizing force for global prices. However, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, China's own energy security is at risk. China is the world's largest importer of oil, and a sustained disruption in the Middle East could lead to a structural crisis in its export-driven economy. Analysts suggest that this shared vulnerability might be the very thing that brings both sides to the table. It is a paradox of the modern age. Even as Washington and Beijing compete for technological supremacy, they are both being held hostage by the same global energy choke points. This suggests that the current summit might be less about winning and more about mutual survival in a volatile energy market. This brings us to the Huawei pivot. While the U.S. sees the delay in Nvidia deliveries as a way to maintain an AI lead, Beijing appears to be using this friction as a catalyst for its own technological independence. By making it difficult for domestic firms to acquire American hardware, the Chinese government is essentially subsidizing its own semiconductor industry through forced adoption. Think of it as a strategic trade-off. China may be willing to accept a 2-year lag in AI performance if it means that by 2030 they are no longer vulnerable to U.S. export controls. This raises a provocative possibility. Is the U.S. Silicon Shield actually accelerating the very thing it was meant to prevent? If Chinese firms like Huawei and DeepSeek can bridge the hardware gap under this pressure, the US loses its most potent form of economic leverage. The diplomatic signaling surrounding Taiwan adds another layer of complexity to this negotiation. The unfulfilled $11 billion arms package stands as a silent witness to the current talks. According to multiple sources, there is a growing perception that the US may be using these defense commitments as a negotiable asset. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, nothing is ever truly off the table. If a significant deal on energy or trade could be reached, one that lowers the cost of living for American voters and stabilizes the global supply chain, would the timing and composition of Taiwan's defense support be adjusted? This doesn't necessarily mean a change in fundamental policy, but it does suggest that the defense for trade calculus is becoming more explicit in the current administration's strategy. Consider the implications for a moment. If Taiwan's defense support is being viewed through a transactional lens, it changes the security architecture of the entire Indo-Pacific region. For Beijing, this would be seen as a major validation of their long-term strategy. For US allies, it might trigger a wave of strategic autonomy, where countries like Japan and South Korea feel the need to accelerate their own independent defense capabilities. This is a classic pattern in geopolitics. When a ruling power begins to prioritize domestic economic stability over overseas commitments, the regional balance of power undergoes a rapid realignment. The question isn't just about whether the arms are delivered, but what the delay says about the changing priorities of the American state. As we look deeper into the energy crisis, the role of Iran becomes a central point of contradiction within the US government. On one hand, you have high-level calls for China to use its leverage over Tehran. On the other, you have a president who suggests that US economic concerns will not dictate the approach to the conflict. This divergence matters because it signals a lack of a unified escalation ladder. If the US isn't clear on what it wants from China regarding Iran, it makes it much harder to reach a lasting agreement. This raises an important question. Is the goal of the summit to end the conflict in the Middle East, or is it simply to find a way to shield the US and Chinese economies from its fallout? Based on the Kerman data, the latter seems more likely. The shift toward economic shielding marks a transition from globalization to a more fragmented, bifurcated world. In this new model, trade doesn't happen based on the lowest cost, but based on the highest level of security. We see this in the requirement that Nvidia chips route through US territory. It is an admission that the global supply chain is no longer trusted. Every component, every barrel of oil, and every line of code is now scrutinized for potential vulnerabilities. This security-first approach adds a permanent layer of cost to the global economy. Think of it like a friction tax that every global corporation must now pay. For a company like Foxconn or Lenovo, this means that their entire business model, which relied on the seamless movement of parts across borders, must now be completely redesigned. The long-term impact of this friction tax will likely be a significant reshoring of critical industries. We are already seeing the early stages of this in the US, with the domestic push for chip manufacturing. But this process takes years, if not decades, to complete. In the meantime, we are stuck in a transition zone, where the old system is breaking down but the new one isn't yet fully functional. This is where the risk of miscalculation is highest. When you have 8 million barrels of oil missing and 0 AI chips being delivered, the margin for error is razor thin. If either side pushes too hard, whether it's on tariffs, technology bans, or regional security, the entire shielding strategy could collapse into a more direct confrontation. Looking forward, the most likely scenario is not a grand bargain that solves every issue, but a series of mini bargains designed to keep the system from overheating. We might see a partial release of the Nvidia chips in exchange for a Chinese commitment to increase agricultural or energy purchases. We might see a temporary cooling-off period in the Taiwan Strait in exchange for a delay in new US tariffs. These aren't permanent solutions, they are economic stabilizers. According to recent reporting, this transactional realism is the defining characteristic of the current administration's foreign policy. It prioritizes immediate, tangible benefits like lower gas prices or increased exports over long-term ideological goals. This brings us to a final, forward-looking insight. The 21st century is increasingly being defined by the politics of scarcity. Whether it's a scarcity of high-end chips, a scarcity of energy due to maritime blockades, or a scarcity of trust between superpowers, the world is moving away from the era of abundance that defined the late 20th century. In this environment, the most successful nations will be those that can secure their own supply chains and innovate their way out of dependency. The Beijing summit is a high-profile recognition of this new reality. President Trump and President Xi are not just negotiating a trade deal, they are negotiating the terms of a new, more guarded relationship. The ultimate takeaway from these developments is that the global village is being replaced by a global fortress model. Each power is building its own walls: digital, economic, and military. The presence of corporate leaders like Jensen Huang at these diplomatic meetings shows that the private sector is now an integral part of this fortress building. But a world of fortresses is also a world of high walls and low visibility. As the US and China continue this delicate dance in Beijing, the rest of the world is watching to see if they can find a way to live behind their respective walls without the entire structure of global trade coming down. The answer will depend on whether they can move past the current standstill and find a way to turn those missing chips and silent weapons into a foundation for a new, if uneasy, stability. The era of engagement is over. The era of managed competition has begun.